Aboriginal leaders in Canada will meet with the country's Prime Minister Stephen Harper on Tuesday, the first official meeting of its kind since he took office in 2006. But will the summit deal with the real issues at hand, or is it just a historic photo opportunity? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu. More than 400 Aboriginal chiefs will meet the Canadian Prime Minister and government ministers at the summit in Ottawa, known as the Crown First Nations Gathering. The aim is to improve the relationship between the Canadian government and what's known as Canada's First Nations communities. That relationship stalled 6 years ago when the current Conservative government abandoned a 5-year, $5 billion plan known as the Kelowna Accord. That agreement sought to improve the education, employment and living conditions for Aboriginal peoples through government funding. Resolving outstanding land claims are some of the top priorities. Aboriginal leaders feel the current process of settling the claims unjustly favours the federal government. Also high on the list is economic development. First Nation leaders want to secure a fair share of revenues from the exploitation of natural resources on Aboriginal lands. And on health and education, most First Nation leaders will be pressing for a commitment to levels of funding and services comparable with those for non-Aboriginal communities. Living conditions made headlines recently in the small Atawapiskat community on James Bay when it was found that people were living in tents, shacks and trailers in temperatures of minus 20 degrees Celsius. Charles Angus is the Member of Parliament for James Bay and represents several First Nation communities. I spoke to him a short while ago.
I represent a region in northern Canada that's about the size of Great Britain. Many of my northern isolated First Nation communities are appalling conditions of poverty. Shanty towns stretched up along the far northern parts of the region. We went into Atawapiskat. The community declared a state of emergency because of a housing crisis. We were almost a month into that crisis. Nobody from the federal or the provincial governments had bothered to even come in and find out what was going on. It took efforts from the Red Cross to set up what was basically an international relief effort to draw attention. The footage we showed, shocking conditions, people living in shacks and sheds, tents, without water, without any plumbing. And this is a region where when we shot the footage, it was just at the freezing mark. Within a week, it had dropped to minus 20. Last week, it was minus 50. So these are really life and death conditions for these people.
Now, we're hearing that the federal government is implementing something called the Emergency Management Plan. What is that?
Well, again, the federal government was completely missing in action for almost a month. The first action they did take was to blame the community for misspending money, which was patently untrue. They then suspended the ability of the community to make any financial decisions. They moved in what's called a third-party manager, which is very much a colonial instrument of punishing the community. We're at a situation now where they're moving some trailers up to address some of the emergency crisis, and you know, the housing conditions are so bad. You have 21 people living in a 2-bedroom house full of mold, other people living in these sheds that were constructed. The problem is that we have these conditions on numerous reserves across northern Canada, and the government prefers to blame the communities for failing, but these are colonial Bantu lands that were set up to fail in the first place, and that's why I think there's so much frustration with the government's lack of a bigger plan.
Is it your experience, as some commentators have been saying, that issues like this come into the public spotlight, they come into the public domain, they catch the imagination of the public, there's a great deal of condemnation, and then a few months down the line it's forgotten about again, and there's no political will on the part of the government to do something on a long-term basis to resolve these problems?
Well, you know, this is not simply a construct of the Conservative government at this time. This is a long-standing problem. I've faced it with previous, the Liberal governments before that. Canadians, you know, we pride ourselves on being a caring nation, but the treatment of our First Nations, it's gone on this long because it's been out of sight, out of mind. With the Atawapiskat crisis, it certainly shook Canada. In a way, it's been, I think, our Katrina moment, because Canadians were shocked that people were living in such dire conditions, but then also shocked that a government had no plan, no seeming interest to respond. I think the government figured it was going to go off the media radar, and it hasn't. And I think that's been a bit of a game changer with this issue. I'm hoping that it seems to be in Canada, there's a larger sense that we need to address these. How do we address them? Where do we go? Those are the big outstanding issues. But there's a lot of expectation that the Prime Minister is actually going to finally get serious about what is really an international disgrace for our nation.
Are there any legal protections in place for these communities, or do the communities themselves have any kind of legal recourse to get matters improved on their lands?
Well, one of the big problems is that Canada's set up a reserve system that is a colonial product, and when you stand up for your rights, you get punished. That's what's happened in Attawapiskat. I've seen that in many other communities. There have been legal precedents where people have taken fights all the way to up through the court system. But we have a system right now where First Nation children are denied basic education rights that are given to every other child in this country. Out of our community in Attawapiskat, children have not had a school for 11 years. They've been in these trashy little portables. I mean, again, this is minus 40 conditions. Those children are taking their fight all the way to the United Nations. Within a month, we have a team of young people going. But the government would prefer to litigate, they would prefer to punish, they'd prefer to cut off funding rather than sit down and say, we have a broken relationship here, we need to fix it, and we need to ensure that children, whether they're First Nation or whether they're other Canadians, that they all are given at least a basic good start in life.
So what is the state of the relationship between Aboriginal communities across North America and their federal governments, and how should these issues be addressed and their living standards improved? Joining us to discuss this are Cindy Blackstock, who's the Executive Director, First Nations Child and Family Caring Society of Canada. She's in Edmonton for us. In the studio, we have Rex Lee Jim, who's the Vice President of the Navajo Nation here in the United States, and Jacqueline Pata, the Executive Director at the National Congress of American Indians. Welcome to all of you to the show. I'm going to start off with Cindy Blackstock there in Edmonton. Thanks for joining us. Now, you heard that interview there with Charles Angus. It was quite an indictment of conditions on that particular community there in northern Canada. And when you look at what's going on there, as well as what is happening in the rest of Canada, you've called it racism. Do you believe it raises to the level of a human rights violation?
Absolutely. And what many of your viewers may not understand is that Canada not only created these reserves, they displaced First Nations laws with provincial child welfare, education, and health laws that should apply to all Canadians. And then the federal government provided far less funding for these services than all other Canadians receive. The result is most horribly experienced by children. 1 in 6 First Nations communities don't even have a basics like water. Some of them are using buckets for sewer. First Nations children get far less funding for education or child welfare to keep them safely in their family homes. The risks go on and on and on, and it's unacceptable in a wealthy country like ours and completely preventable.
Okay, let's cross the border to the United States. Jacqueline Patton, let me ask you about these issues. Same issues that they have in Canada, things like housing, education, provision of water, electricity for Native Americans here in the United States. What's been the experience here?
Well, we've had the same kind of crises in many of our communities. We have some tribes who have been able to address those with and augment some of the resources from the federal government to provide the needed financial assistance to help address those issues. I think one thing that we've done, particularly with this administration, is this government-to-government relationship, this being able to sit down with the administration and talk about, make recommendations for improvement. Clearly, the crisis for healthcare dollars and education dollars is very consistent with Canada. We have a difficult time being able to fund even our bus transportation systems in our schools. So all those are really critical areas. But in the U.S., the tribal governments and tribal leaders like the president and vice president sitting next to me are very engaged in what those policies look like and how they get to implement them in their own community. But tribes have to step up and be able to try to help find their own resources to supplement the huge gaps.
Let me just clarify something here. You have sovereign rights in these tribal lands, right? So how does federal funding fit into that?
We have sovereign rights in our tribal lands. However, the federal government sees themselves as the more supreme sovereign. So in the Constitution, it says we recognize the sovereignty of the federal government, the states governments, and the tribal governments. But the federal government is being the, as they see themselves as supreme sovereign.
So it's a very diluted sovereign right.
And what happened is in trade for transfer for our ceded lands, when the immigrants came across to the United States and took our lands in trade for that, we had treaties, and those treaties protected our rights for funding, for healthcare, for education, for housing, for infrastructure that's necessary for healthy and thriving communities. And one policy after another from the federal government has given us limited access to resources to make it be a level playing field, particularly because many of the lands, like Navajo Nation, there are very difficult lands to live under, and the reservations that have been determined by the federal government sometimes are the most rural or the most challenging of lands to live within.
Rexley, Jim, there was a declaration that was adopted by the United Nations in 2007. It's known as DRIP, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I was wondering, does it further the cause and resolve some of the problems that Jacqueline's been talking about among native Indians on these lands?
Yeah, it certainly does. It is important for indigenous nations to participate at the global level, to have a say in how those international laws and instruments are created, and then how it's applied within states as well as within tribal governments. The Navajo Nation was involved at that level as a government, not as an NGO or as an individual, but rather as a government. And we had a hard time participating as a government simply because other nation states say, you're not a nation state, therefore you cannot participate as a native government, but rather as an NGO or some other form. And so we're still fighting that. We would like to participate as native governments because we are governments. The Navajo Nation has a 3-branch government. We have the judicial branch, we have the executive branch, and the legislative branch.
Are there any elements of that UN declaration that could be adopted on, say, a national basis here in the United States, that's between you and the United States government?
Well, there's an interesting development because before the U.S. Government, the president endorsed it, several states within the United States adopted the declaration before the U.S. did as a government. And we could do that at that level. At a national level, I think it's important that because of the government-to-government relationship, that it implements certain programs. And what's surprising to me is many of the articles within the declaration, a lot of the programs are already happening in the U.S. And it just needs to be expanded. For example, there's the 638 program about Indian Self-Determination Education Assistance Act. And within that, we get funding from the government. We can contract with the U.S. government and run our own schools. I'm a product of what the Rock Point Community School, which is a 638 contract school, and a local monolingual speaking Navajo was a board, and they determine who needs to be hired and who gets fired, the policies and procedures, and the curriculum. And we've made tremendous advancement in that school.
So you want more autonomy?
We want more autonomy.
Okay. Yeah, let's go back to Cindy Blackstock in Edmonton. Cindy, there is this meeting that's taken place between Stephen Harper, the Canadian Prime Minister, and leaders of Aboriginal groups in Canada, the so-called Crown First Nations meeting. Let's go back to the question that we posed right at the outset of the program. Is this going to be or present itself as an opportunity for changes to take place, or is it just going to be another photo op?
That depends on what the government does. I mean, it's important for your viewers to know that only in about 3 weeks' time, the federal government will appear in court to answer claims that it's racially discriminating against First Nations children by providing less funding in child welfare. They've tried to derail that hearing using legal technicalities to keep the truth of the matter, having a full hearing on the facts, away from Canadians and away from the world. If Prime Minister Harper is serious about putting the relationship between First Nations and the Government of Canada back on the right track, one of the first things he could do is allow this hearing to go forward, to put all the facts on the table, to see whether the Canadian government in 2012 is racially discriminating against children. We think the facts line up to say yes, they are, not only in child welfare, but in many other services across the world. And the opportunity here is to present those facts to the international community, because the racial discrimination against First Nations children has been so normalized in this country that many caring Canadians can no longer see it. So the world needs to give Canada a wake-up call and say that there is no legitimate discrimination in the worldwide, including under the UN Declaration of Indigenous Peoples. Canada is a contravention of international and domestic law.
Let's look at the situation in the United States. You know, we're going, of course, it's election season here in the
Right.
United States, and we hear about it all the time on television, on radio, in newspapers, etc. You don't hear a single word about the rights of indigenous peoples here in the United States, so about Native Indians. Let's listen to President Obama's pledge, and he made this personal pledge to Native Americans in 2009. Let's watch.
I understand what it means to be on the outside looking in. I know what it means to feel ignored and forgotten, and what it means to struggle. So you will not be forgotten as long as I'm in this White House.
President Obama, now 2012, this year has been declared the year of the native vote. What does that mean?
Well, that means that we're gearing up for this presidential election. You're right. This is what 2012 is all about. And we know that we make differences in these elections. In key states, we have large populations of voters. We could actually swing votes, but we can be very informed voters. And so we make differences, particularly in the area. There's like 26 states that people really care about. All of those are where there's high populations of natives. We saw what happened in Alaska last year with the Lisa Murkowski election. 20% voters in Alaska, they made a difference. She attributes her win to Alaska Natives voting. And that's what we hope to see across the nation in those areas where there's tight elections and our population will vote and make differences. But what happened for us in gearing up to this, when President Obama ran for his presidential election, he put forward an Indian platform that had some really key components to it. And in our Native Vote initiative, we kind of help keep the feet to the fire a little bit there. We make sure that we follow up with whoever gets elected in the transition team around those campaign commitments. You'll see President Obama's campaign commitment said he was going to have an annual meeting, just like the Prime Minister is having, but in Canada, but have an annual meeting with tribal leaders, and he's held true to that.
This is the White House Tribal Nations Conference.
The White House Tribal Nations Conference, and he's had it every year. But we didn't want it to be a photo op. We wanted to have real substance, and so tribal leaders across the country, we gear up for it. We talk about key issues. We work closely with people in the White House, saying these are the things that the tribal leaders want to be able to talk about and bring forward. And we try to put forward a document at that meeting with real recommendations and give some guidance to what can be accomplished in the next year. So we see these meetings, and just like our Native Vote, as creating a platform for moving and raising the bar a little higher for the next presidential, the next president.
Rixley, Jim, you know, one of the things that we hear very often about conditions on tribal lands is poor social conditions, which lead to things like drug abuse, alcoholism, etc. It's become almost a stereotypical thing when you're talking about the conditions on these lands that people talk about. The rising rates of drug abuse, the rising rates of alcoholism. What is being done about that, and what kind of help are you getting from the federal government?
We have a program, what's called Temporary Aid to Native Families, considered TANF. And the Navajo Nation took over that program, and we got the money, and we called it a program for self-reliance. And one of the things that we're doing there is, in order for families to continue to receive that, they need to be going to school, they need to be in certain workshops regarding how to find a job. And so in that sense, the Navajo Nation itself is taking over, and our own people are running them, the programs. And our own people with degrees and who've gone through the academic programs, they're running the show, so they're in a position to say, I did it. I came from a similar background like yours, and you're able to do this. So we're setting up programs like that. And then we're also getting programs for suicide preventions, and there's a lot of issues involved. And one example is the Head Start program that we have. And we truly believe that if we have first access to the minds of our own young people and instill in them traditional values of doing things for yourself, being there for your family when needed, those are the types of programs that we need to put in place at the Head Start level at an early age, and then develop from there. So those are the kinds of programs that we're doing. But no, like any social program, that we're not getting enough funding. We would love to have more funding so we can do more.
Okay.
Can I just add to that? Yeah, because I think it all ties back to UNDRIP again too, because the education, the protection, cultural protections, as well as being able to continue our cultural practices and ingrain them in our education systems, brings that pride that actually helps create the cycle against some of the social disparity conditions in our communities. And so that's why something like UNDRIP is so important, to help us make sure that Department of Education understands language immersion programs make differences in our communities for a lot of reasons, and not just for the academic success, but the personal success.
Okay, I want to get to natural resources and their fair and equitable distribution. Now, as the Canadian government promotes the extraction of oil and other natural resources, it's increasingly coming into conflict with the needs of First Nation communities. Health environmental concerns prompted tribal chiefs last year to reject a proposed pipeline from the tar sands to the Pacific coast. Earlier this month, a First Nation group sued the government for $10 billion, alleging they weren't adequately compensated for potash and oil developments on their land. A diamond mine projected to become one of the richest in the world is just upstream from the poverty-stricken town of Attawapiskat. The mine is on traditional lands, but the royalties flow to the province. Let's go back to Cindy Blackstock. What is being done about this to distribute natural resources of the country in a way that benefits everybody?
Well, you know, First Nations have raised this for the last number of decades, saying that it's not about being against economic development. It's about being for economic development in ways that support First Nations communities, support all Canadians, and protect our environment for future generations. The Government of Canada has really been wanting to enter into resource discussions in ways that heavily advantage the Government of Canada and disadvantage, in many cases, First Nations communities and all Canadians. That's something the chiefs are trying to shift the ground on with the government tomorrow, and I know that that'll be something that they'll press going forward, because many of the social challenges we see in our community are driven by things like poverty and inadequate housing that's linked to poverty. So being able to empower community members through proper education, job training, and economic development is really critical for the success of First Nations and for allowing us to make a better contribution to all Canadians in the country as well as around the world.
And a good example of that is the Navajo Nation Oil and Gas Company.
Right.
The Navajo Nation itself invested $10 million into this company to start it up, and now it's more than $400 million, and it's learning how to balance the environment versus economic development.
And you had a similar situation with uranium mining.
Yes, and we also looked at uranium mining. We weren't in charge of that, but when the companies left, they left open pits and people got into it and they're suffering from it. So the Navajo Nation Council put a moratorium on that. And so we have those kind of jurisdiction, no more uranium mining on Navajo until that's lifted. But companies are challenging it. They're challenging our jurisdiction, they're challenging our sovereign right to protect our people, and so they're doing what they can to undo that. But we're standing firm on that.
Jacqueline, you mentioned earlier on the small numbers of Indigenous peoples in the United States, but they can exercise their political muscle in some way. Are politicians aware of that as we go into this election season?
Yes, we make them aware of it. As part of one of our 4 key pieces is to educate the candidates, encourage them to have platforms on Native American issues, so they message well to our folks, and then of course from our end to be able to educate our members to be informed voters.
Okay. We are going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid. We've run out of time. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it from the team here in Washington, D.C. for now. But we want to hear from you. Tell us what stories you think we should be covering. You can send your ideas directly to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Bye for now.